Okay, amazing. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. So let's jump straight into content testing, the good, the bad, and the highlighter method. So in today's talk, we're going to be covering the who, which is basically me and my company. We're going to be talking a little bit about why we need content testing, what methods we can use, how we can actually carry them out, the practicalities of actually running content testing sessions, including some examples, well, including one example in detail from Cuvva. And then we'll have a bit of a chat at the end. So any questions that you want to ask me, anything you want to kind of raise, we'll be able to discuss those bits at the end. So the who, let's jump into who I am. So hello, I'm Grace. I do testing. So I'm a content designer at Cuvva. I've also worked for Mojo Men. And we are a tech company who are building radically better insurance. And so content is a huge part of that. Anyone here who's used an insurance product in the past, which I'm going to guess is all of you, will probably know that insurance isn't the most easy to understand, user-friendly kind of product or industry. So how did I end up doing kind of content design? So I have a degree in psychology, a Bachelor of Science, and I have a master's in marketing. And neither of those are kind of content specific, but I actually think they give me a really good background for content design. I actually think that psychology is probably more important for my role than my writing ability. As I'm sure you're all aware, and also championing clear, simple, plain English is kind of the way forward. This is the way that that companies are trying to do things now. We don't want to make people look and feel stupid anymore. We want people to understand what they're doing. We want people to understand how they're interacting with our products and what this means. And so the psychology, the understanding of humans, the understanding of the language they use, the frameworks they have for different concepts is all super, super important. I'm just going to admit some people, sorry. Okay, cool. I think we're good. This is probably why I enjoy content testing so much. It's really based in humans, in people, and how they respond, how they react. It's all about understanding what makes people tick, what resonates with them. Is it this phrase or that phrase? Is it this feature or that feature? All of these things that kind of come down to communicating well with our users. So let's talk about what we've done at Cuvva so far. If the slide will move. So we only started doing content specific testing in 2020. So Feb 2020, we hired our head of research, Lucia. She was our first proper research hire. And we started ramping up our testing efforts. By May, we'd completed our first piece of content specific research, which was highlighter testing. And then we actually brought somebody on board in August to run content specific testing. So before all of this, we did do usability testing, but it only rarely led to content improvements. We didn't really learn a lot about what worked and what didn't. We only knew that content needed improving if people were having a really hard time with it. And we weren't actually trying to optimize our language. We weren't trying to, we weren't necessarily doing the best job that we could have been with that. Fast forward to now, April 2021, we've completed 8 content-specific research projects. So that's just things we've done off our own back as a content team, basically me and the researcher. And then we've included content testing in lots of other projects that have been happening around the company. So why did we start doing content-specific testing? Why is it important? So the first thing is to check comprehension, and this is probably the most obvious one. This is probably what you probably all nodding your heads thinking, yeah, this makes sense. So do users understand what we're saying? Do they know what to do next? Do they know what will happen when they do that? Content that's confusing adds to cognitive load, and cognitive load is basically the pressure that users feel during the navigation or usage of a site or an app when they're trying to complete a task. So if we think about that in terms of fuel gauge, Users might start with a full tank, and everything that we do that is difficult or taxing, we kind of use a bit of that fuel. And if it gets too much, if we use up too much of that fuel, users are going to drop off. And so we need to make sure throughout the journey, the content that we're providing people is not asking too much of our users. And so the second one is to check sentiment. So comprehension is just the first step. Content can be super easy to understand, but still not resonate with a user. And users need to, at the very least, not dislike what they're reading on your screens. So you might have heard this before. I'm not quite sure where the first time I heard this, the first place I heard this was, but the best kind of content is the kind that no one notices. So if people are able to skim over it without having to pause and think, you have done your job well. So my best advice on this one is to think about what you want people to think, do, and feel after reading your content. And testing helps us to make sure that we've done that. So I think effectively words and tone that resonate with people to create an experience that's beautifully forgettable is exactly what we're trying to do here. And I think often when you're competing with the likes of designers and engineers, designers are always creating beautiful screens, and engineers are always performing cool tricks, and content designers are always missed off the meeting invite. And I think that can kind of lead sometimes to a crisis of confidence, whereby you're trying to think of something really cool or charming to say. But the problem with that is that not everyone thinks the same things are funny or the same things are charming. And with good content testing, we can have the same level of confidence in our boring but really clear and really effective content that a designer might have in a really beautiful screen. And it just gives our work some real validation that I think we all probably feel like we need. And then the third one is to learn how to connect with users. And this is the one that I think people often forget about when it comes to content testing. It's not just, does it make sense and do they like it? It's an opportunity to have a conversation with your users and learn something about them. And the thing I've found across my career, that the biggest thing when it comes to content is that the two most important things are language and storytelling. And it doesn't matter if you miss some punctuation or your sentence isn't perfectly structured. If you can reflect the right language, and if you can tell a story that your users are engaged with, your content is doing its job. And testing is a really incredible way to do that. It gives us insight into the language that people use around your topic or your product. And if we can mirror that language back to them in the products and services that they're using, you create a really nice, seamless experience that people want to return to time and time again. And if you can tap into the stories and experiences that people have around your product or your service, you can reflect this back. You can use this in your content to create something that they can engage with on a deeper level, and that really connects with them. So if that's why we do content testing, what is content testing? What kind of things can we do? So I'm going to start off by going through a few methods. I'm not going to go into huge detail. I'm just going to explain what these methods are. I've picked quite a few, but the list isn't exhaustive, and there's lots and lots that you can do. And then later on, we're going to talk about the practicalities. So the how do you actually do this? How do you set it up? What does it look like? And so all of the methods I'm going to speak about in this particular talk are methods for content that you already have. So this might be content that is already live on your website and you want to find out why it's doing really well, why it's doing really badly. It could be content that that you haven't yet released and you kind of want to see if it works or not. This isn't about identifying user needs or finding out what content you need to write. This is taking pre-existing content and seeing if it works. So the first one I want to talk about, little clue in the title to the talk, is highlighter testing. And this is actually the first type of testing that we did at Cuvva, because it's just so easy and intuitive. So it gives a really good insight into general sentiment and also comprehension. Does it resonate? Does it make sense? All of these really important things when it comes to content. And so what you do is you give your user a piece of content and you ask them to go through it in full. You don't want to interrupt them. You want them to read it as if they were kind of at home in their own environment. But as they go, ask them to highlight things. So an example, and quite a common one for highlighter testing, is what they like, what they don't like, and anything they don't understand. And you give them these 3 different colors, and it can be done online or it can be done in person. Obviously, one day, hopefully, COVID will go away and we'll be able to do that again. And then once they've finished the whole piece, you go through it together and you talk about the bits they've highlighted and why. So other things that you can use this for could be, are we building trust with this content? And you could get them to highlight in green what they trust, in red what they don't trust. And then, you know, if there is anything that they kind of pause on, they can go with a different color for that. It doesn't just have to be about what they like and what they don't like. But as I say, I think this is probably the most common way that it's used. So it's a good idea when you do this kind of testing to have some questions ready for the end. So a lot of the time you'll get people who are quite open to having a conversation with you about why they've highlighted what they have. But sometimes you'll get someone who'll just say, I liked that, I didn't like that. And that's not really what you want. What you're looking for in this kind of testing is a bit more of an in-depth understanding to why the language makes them feel the way it feels. So maybe you could ask them things like what they liked about it. Maybe you can ask them what they would do next after interacting with this content. How would they describe it to a friend? There's so many interesting things that you can ask them, and depending what you're trying to find out, you can kind of switch it up. And then when you're done, you'll create a document like this one that you can see here on the right. And what we've done here is change the shading of each color. So we've actually used blue instead of orange, but it's exactly the same kind of gist. But you kind of change the shading, and the darker it is, the more that people liked it or didn't like it, the stronger they felt. So it kind of represents how many people. So where we've got really dark red, a lot of people didn't like that. And where we've got a lot of dark green, a lot of people thought that's amazing. And then of course you write up the notes from the conversation you've had and kind of complete some sentiment analysis on that. And the second one is close testing. So close testing is where you remove words from your content and ask people to fill in the gaps. It helps to test the context, so the wider piece of content that it sits within, the expectations of your user at that stage, and their level of knowledge as well around this kind of topic. So it's very commonly used with longer form content like a blog post or an info page on the web. And the recommended approach is to remove every 6th word. So you're kind of picking them at random. As you might be able to spot from the screen here where we've done it, we didn't follow that. We picked the words that we thought were most important, but I'm going to use this as an example later, so I'll go into why we did that a little bit more. But yeah, it's a wonderful way to test the context and general comprehension of what you're talking about, because if the context is right, people will likely be able to fill in the gaps. It really helps with expectations, because if a user has landed on a page and they expect to see something, they will fill in the gaps with what they expect to see. So often with close testing, the words that people get wrong, the incorrect things that they say, are more insightful than when they get it right. When they get it right, amazing, it's a tick, it means the content is working. But it's actually quite nice when they get it wrong, because you get a little bit of juicy insight into what they're thinking, what framework they've brought to this kind of content. And then finally, it tells you a bit about their level of knowledge at this stage. So if I'm brand new to mortgages, I might expect that monthly payments are a thing. But if you're talking about interest in one of the gaps, and I don't really know anything about interest around mortgages, I might say the word payment instead of interest, and that will tell you perhaps there needs to be more explanation or something else needs to come first to kind of provide that level of knowledge. So that's close testing. This one is super, super quick and easy. It's called a 5-second test, the clues in the title. So what you want to do with this one is get a screen or a web page that has headings, titles, bullet points, that kind of thing. And you give it to them for 5 seconds and you let them scan it. And then you remove it and ask them to tell you what they expect to find on that page. So the reason this is really good is because, a good title should tell people what they expect to find on that page. If people can't understand from the title what it means, or what's coming up, you probably need to make the title a little bit more informative. And it can also be super useful for navigation and stuff, because often a title will relate to menu items and that kind of thing on a website nav. And so if they don't understand from the title what it is, it's unlikely they're going to be able to find the right content in the right place, because they'll be looking at that menu thinking, well, I know what I want to see, but I don't know where I can expect to find that. So it can be really useful for that as well. Also a really nice one for just tacking it on to any other kind of testing that you're doing. Like, anyone has 5 seconds to help you with that. So it's a really nice little one to slip in there if you've got anything that kind of meets those requirements. So card sorting. We've never actually done this one at Cuvva. I really want to give it a go, but there's so much to test and so many testing projects we're working on, and this one hasn't really been the most obvious choice yet, so we haven't done it. But I thought I'd talk about it anyway, because it's a really big and important one. So it helps with categorization, which gives you a good understanding of the framework a user is bringing to your product or service. And I keep talking about this concept of a framework. And for those of you who have never heard that concept before, it's basically how you structure information in your head. And they tend to be kind of developed when you're young. Perhaps you have a framework of what a relationship might look like based on how you've interacted with your parents. And that framework becomes almost the place where you hang all of the information that you gather beyond that point. And so for something like insurance, the first time you've ever interacted with an insurance product will provide you with a framework for how it works. And that will be a kind of set of expectations and standards, and everything you learn, you apply that framework to it. So it's a really useful way to understand how your users think about things and how they interact with things. So for card sorting, how do users group the information? What makes sense to them? What goes together well? Where do they expect to find certain information? And again, this can be super useful for things like website navigation, but just in general, in terms of like how to structure your content and information hierarchy and all of that, card sorting can be really useful. I did a UX course with General Assembly a couple of weeks ago, and the way that they introduced it I thought was really nice. So they did a test where they gave loads of different people a bunch of different confectionery items, and they asked them to sort them. And some people thought, okay, I'll put the chocolate with the chocolate, the hard-boiled sweets with the hard-boiled sweets, and so on. Other people thought, okay, well, these ones all have yellow labels, these ones all have pink labels. Other people thought, okay, well, the size, these chocolate bars are quite big, whereas this individual wrapped candy is like, only a small snack, and sorted it like that. So I think that's a really nice way of kind of talking about card sorting. And if you think about that in terms of maybe the different pages that you have on your website, how do people make sense of them? And you kind of want to think about the majority of people and how they work and use it like that. So sentiment testing, this one isn't a specific type of testing in the same way that like highlighter or close is. You can do this in so many ways, and I'd recommend that you get creative because there are so many ways to do it. So you kind of want to think, what does the user want to think and feel from your perspective? And the testing helps you see if you are actually living up to that. So we've done this in so many ways. Highlighter testing is one of them, just thinking about whether they like it or not. But it goes one step further than understanding and really taps into whether or not people resonate with your content. And I totally understand that for the majority of us, we don't work for glamorous, exciting companies like Netflix, and we're not going to have people who think, God, I just love this company. Like, people are never going to love insurance, they're probably never going to love the government website, but it's just trying to make people feel good when they're on your site, to make them feel like they're in the right place. And so we've used this quite a lot actually for our tone of voice. We think our tone of voice is really friendly and trustworthy, but we don't necessarily know that. So we've put it out there, and we've used these kind of emoji slider scales to ask people how they actually feel about it and get them to rate it. Another one, and this one might be applicable to quite a few of you. I'm not sure what the kind of situation in your company is, but I've heard from a lot of content designers that actually content testing isn't really thought of as important, or isn't really given the time at their companies. So this one's a really important one. It's just basically doing whatever you can do to get a bit of feedback. So you can ask colleagues who didn't work on that particular piece. You can share it on Facebook or ask friends or family members. Obviously, be careful what you share on Facebook. If your company isn't comfortable with that, you might want to check first. You can go into cafes and ask strangers for a few minutes of their time, which used to be a really big one pre-March 2020. And as you can imagine, hasn't really been used all that much since then. But one day, perhaps, I thought I'd include it anyway. So here you can see a post that I've put on Slack, which is our communication tool at work, where I'm writing some screens and I'm stuck and I don't have time to put together a prototype or, recruit participants or book in research sessions. I just want to speak to some humans and ask them, what do you think about this? So I've sent it to my team, and I've got quite a lot of feedback and comments on there, 25 replies, which is really, really useful. It pushes me in the right direction. And so it's not going to lead to perfect results. You're not testing it properly, but it will give you some insight. And remember how many hours you've spent looking at this piece of content and how in your head you are about it. You have all the context. Just asking somebody who doesn't have that can give you really useful things. And my top tip with this one is, if you can get 2 or 3 people to answer a couple of questions, that's great. Ask the same questions for consistency, because then you can look for themes between the 2 or 3 or 4 people that you've spoken to. And try and pull out some themes. And for this kind of stuff, I'd recommend keeping it really top level. Questions that anyone can answer. So like, does this make sense? Just like, general English, does this make sense? Do you like it? There isn't anything in there that offends you, or, all of that kinds of things. And save the really specific questions for users who actually have a need for your product. Like, I wouldn't ask my boyfriend what feature description he preferred for insurance when he doesn't have a car and isn't going to buy car insurance, because his insight isn't actually useful to me. I'm not trying to make this content resonate with him, but I would ask him, does this make sense? Do you understand what I'm talking about here? And that can be super useful. So I'd say use it, but with a hefty pinch of salt. And then finally, get creative. So you really don't need to follow the rule book when it comes to testing. And actually, when I was putting this presentation together, I realized quite a lot of the testing that we've done isn't as simple as, oh, we just did highlighter testing, we just did close testing. We've really thought, what are we trying to find out from our users? Like, what's the question we have here, and what's the best way we can access that? And we always just make up our own things, like the emoji rating scale we just made up because it seemed to work. So, if you need to know if someone understands something, ask them to read it and repeat it back to you. You don't need highlighters, you don't need gaps or anything. If you want to know someone's thoughts, give them something and then ask them to describe your product out loud as if they were talking to a friend about it. What language are they using? Are they using the same language as you, or are they using different? Because that's a really interesting insight. So now we're going to move on to the how, so the more kind of practical side of actually testing content. So the first thing I think it's important to go through is a little testing checklist. So these are the kind of things you need to be thinking about before you embark on your testing. So what's your research question? What are you actually trying to find out? That one is super important because it's going to help you think about what kind of method. What kind of data do you need? It sounds scary, but it's really not, and we'll get into that in a minute. What kind of users do you need, and what tools will you need? And once you have all of this, you'll be raring and ready to go. So in terms of your research question, it's just basically thinking, what do you need to know from your users? What answers do you need to know if your content has been successful or not? And often with this kind of testing, it's super broad because you already know what the needs of these users are. You should really know that before you start writing your content. So you have quite a lot of context around it. You just want to know if what you've done to meet those needs actually meets them and does it work? Does it make sense? Do they like it? What's their opinion of it? But it can also be super, super specific. If you've identified a problem, and you're trying to solve a specific problem, you'll have a very pointed question in mind. So some examples: do our users understand how to make a payment? That one's quite pointed. That might have come about because you think that they don't know how to make a payment and you've made a fix and you want to test it. But then other ones like, do they like this content? Can they easily find it? All of these kinds of things are much more broad. So let's look at those questions and see how we can map them to some testing. So for the first one, do our users understand how to make a payment? I would probably do some close testing. So I would take the screen that explained how to make a payment. I would strategically remove some words. I would ask them to go through, see how many they got right. And then I would give them a completed screen and ask them to repeat it back to me. So we've got this idea of whether they've got the right context. We understand their level of knowledge around this thanks to the close testing, but then I'm going to ask them to repeat it back to me so I understand, do you actually know what it says? And often people will tell you, yes, I understand this. And when you ask them to repeat it back to you, they'll explain it wrong, or they'll say something that you think, you haven't actually understood it. So that's a really interesting way to double check that people do know, because I think a lot of the time people will just tell you, I totally understand, and they might not. Do our users like this content? This is a really big one. Highlighter testing is perfect. Sentiment testing with an emoji scale or like scales or anything like that would be perfect. Can our users easily find this content? So card sorting or a 5-second test would be really good for this. But you might not have the time or the tools to set that up. So ask them to find it on your site. If you want to know, do users know how to find the section on payments? Set them up on your website, give them a computer and ask them to find it. Ask them what they'd search for. If they were looking for that information online, how to make a pension payment, what would they search for? All of these things really give useful information into the language, the thought process, all of these things that we need to know as content designers in order to create really good content. Does our tone of voice generate trust? Sentiment testing, so the emoji rating scale that I showed you before is exactly how we've measured this twice. And does this make sense? Chat to friends and colleagues, give it to them. What do they think? Do they say, yes, it makes sense? Most people will be able to tell you whether something makes sense or not without necessarily having to have a really good understanding. And if these people don't have an understanding of, say, insurance, but they understand what you're writing, you've done a very good job. You've been able to make it really simple, really concise. And so that's great. And you haven't had to spend loads of time setting up these kind of elaborate tests. So data collection, this one is a little bit scary, and this is where I think a lot of people go, although content designers, maybe not, maybe we're a bit more there with all the data and the web analytics and whatnot. But there's two different types. There's quantitative and there's qualitative. So as you can see here, this top bit is quantitative. It gives us numbers. It tells you the general consensus. So here we ask people to rate us, how strong a personality we had, how trustworthy we are, how confident we were based on our tone of voice. And then we worked out an average for all of them. So that's really interesting because it gives you, the kind of the bigger number. And that's often quite sexy to companies having, we've said, 80% of people think this. That can often be a really nice thing to have when you're kind of trying to bring people around to the idea of content testing. But the qualitative data, like this quote down here, gives you the why. It's the really rich feedback that you'll get from individual people and then pick themes from. And ideally, you're going to want to use both. But with budgets and time, etc., you don't have to. I think the main message I want you to take away from this today is that anything is better than nothing, especially if you've not tried content testing before. Just doing a little bit and getting it off the ground is really useful, and you don't need to do it fancy. You don't need to follow all the rules. Just get out there and speak to your users. But if you were doing both, you would probably, depending on your research question, you'd probably pick an order. So if we wanted to know if people thought we were trustworthy, we would go with this scale at the top here. We might run that on its own. We might ask people these questions on their own to find out if people do think we're trustworthy. And you can see here, people have said 3.5 out of 5. That's not ideal. If it was a 5, we might say, brilliant, we thought we were trustworthy, we've tried to do that, it's clearly working, we'll move on. But we can see here, it's not necessarily as good as it could be. So then maybe we'd go in with a qualitative bit of research and chat to people and ask them why, and find out, what is it that makes you think this or feel this. And that's this quote underneath about, when you're speaking to someone like a friend, for me, it just makes me trust someone a bit more. And then you end up with, a general idea, like the general consensus, which is super useful, but you also understand why and how to change it. Whereas if you wanted to know if one particular piece of content made sense, you would speak to a couple of people first. You'd get them to read it and you'd discuss it. And then based on what they said, you might put that piece of content live on your website and use web analytics to see, are people enjoying this? Is it working? And you'd kind of use it the other way around. So you'd get that deep insight, that kind of exploratory data first by chatting to people and finding out what they thought. Then you would test it with many more people. And this is really the way we tend to do it at Cuvva. We do a test with about 5 people with some content and make some changes off the back of it. Then we might put it live to 10% of people in the app and see what happens. Does conversion rate improve? How many people are interacting with this? We might look at the amount of questions we get at customer support. Do people understand the information they've received? That kind of thing. But like I say, it's really dependent on your research question and what you're trying to find out. And if this scares people, just remember, we're just looking for confirmation. We just want to know, do people like this? Do they agree with this? Is this what people are looking for? And it's as simple as that. It doesn't need to be anything too elaborate, especially when you're kind of first starting out with content testing. Thinking about which users to talk to. This chart, is this a chart here on the right, is from the Norman Nielsen group, and they basically did a lot of research into how many users you need. And the good news is you don't need hundreds of people to be testing your content. You can find the same problems with 5 users that you can with 10 or 15 or more. But it is important, if you're going to be basing in your kind of content on these findings, think about 2 things. Number 1, do they have a real need for this content? And number 2, do they meet the requirements for your product or service? So people who have a real need for the content are going to engage with it a lot more. They're also probably going to have a more authentic experience around that content. So say it's to do with mortgages. I know nothing about them. I don't have one. I've never looked into them. So I might read a whole web page and say, yep, that makes sense. It's perfect. But if I'm actually in the market for a mortgage, I might have a lot of questions that you haven't answered, and I'm bringing real life experience to your testing that's going to be super useful. So this is kind of what I was saying earlier about that quick and dirty research. Don't ask them if the content is good or if it meets their needs. Ask them, does it make sense? And save those kind of chunkier questions for people who actually will use your service. And then, do they meet the requirements? So this is things like age. If your product is only, so for us as an insurance company, we can only insure people up to, I think, the age of 65. So there's no point me chatting to an 80-year-old about what they think, because they won't use the service. Likewise, do they have a driver's license? Because if they don't, they're probably not in the market for car insurance and probably not going to be able to help me. So that's just kind of something to think about. And then actually getting users. So with this, you know who you kind of need to speak to, what the demographics are, but you don't necessarily know how to reach out to them. And this can be a little bit of a sticking point, to be honest. Sometimes it's really easy. You might have access to the kind of people who are going to be using your content right there in your place of work. But it's often not the case. So you have to get a little bit creative. So I've kind of included some free ways to do it, because I know that not everyone on this call is going to have the budget or the buy-in to be able to be, you know, paying services to go out and recruit participants. But posting on your company's social media, even running cheap ads, you know, putting like £50 behind an ad or something on social media, Gumtree, emailing anyone who's on your mailing list, including something in a newsletter to say, hey, do you want to get involved? For these, you might need to use incentives, but if you're super clever about it and you position it in the right way, you might not need to. So sometimes people are just interested in, you know, what you're working on. If your service really impacts them, then they might want to get involved anyway, just from, you know, a selfish point of view. They might just want to have their say. They might have a lot of feedback to give. You know, if they've had a bad time with a particular service, they might really want to get that off their chest, and you can capitalize on that. But to be truthful, we've had varying levels of success with this kind of thing. And I do believe that if you want really valuable insights, you do need to invest. And so obviously we're probably further along than many other companies of our size in terms of research. We have 3 people on a research team. We have a whole dedicated budget to spend on tools and to pay people for their time and that kind of thing. And I think that is probably where you'd want to end up eventually. But I understand that's not possible right now for a lot of companies, and especially if you're just kind of trying to learn a bit about content testing today, so you can bring that back and try it out. Definitely don't go in straight away asking for a budget. Try some of the smaller, easier things first, so that you can prove out, you know, why it would be worth investing in, and start small. And then finally, tools. You know, what are the practicalities? How can we actually run sessions? And you'll probably be pleased to hear that I actually rely on the Google Suite a lot. No real bells or whistles. It works perfectly, especially in the remote world that we've all been living in for the past year. So you can just join people on a Google Meet. You can share your screen. They can share their screen. Really simple. For any kind of content that you have, you can just put it in a Google Doc. They can do close testing, highlight testing. They can talk about sentiment. You know, we made our emoji rating scale in Google Docs and sent that out to people. 5-second testing, all of those work perfectly with a Google Doc. You don't need anything fancier. And then Google Slides for card sorting. If you've got lots of different things, people can move them around on the screen and you can see what they're doing. They're free, they're accessible, they're easy to use, and I would recommend them. We have used other tools at Cuvva. We've used Look Back quite a lot, Useberry, Metro Retro, although I know from experience that doesn't always work on everyone's work systems. But things like Look Back are really handy for running remote sessions. And so if you've got a bit of a budget to invest in that, then I definitely recommend looking into some of those tools. So I'm just going to run you through a few top tips that I've kind of come across in my time, and then I'll give you one example of how we've done it at Cuvva. I was going to give you more examples, but it's just too much to talk through, guys. It's too much to talk through. So I've got 5 top tips. The first one, test the content on its own where you can. So where possible, strip it from a fancy screen, strip it from your company's website, put it in a Google Doc with nothing else. And the reason I say this is twofold. If the content works without the context of a fancy web page, or without the, you know, the usability elements, the UX features, then it's going to work really well on its own, within it, sorry. When you put it back in, it's going to work really well. And you can be sure of that, because it's not being propped up by a big green button that says click here, you know. Although no button should ever say click here. That's a really awful, that'd be a terrible CTA. And it also removes distractions. So what I've found a lot with usability testing is that people get really bogged down with colors. and placement and all of this kind of thing. And you just really want to know, does this make sense? And they just cannot stop talking about the fact that the button is the wrong shade of green and they don't like that shade of green. And it just doesn't really work. So where possible, for the majority of our testing, we have put it into a Google Doc on its own and really let the content speak for itself. But there have been exceptions, and there will be exceptions. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes it needs to sit within a flow. Some content just wouldn't make sense if it was just in a Google Doc. It needs the other elements on the screen, which leads me on to my second top tip. So if you can't strip it and put it in a Google Doc, you need to learn how to wireframe. So I don't actually know how many people here will know how to do this. Maybe you all do. This is a really useless tip, but I can't emphasize it enough. If you're trying to work alongside designers and engineers and part of product teams, and if you're really trying to contribute and influence that end product with your content, you need to be able to visually represent your ideas. I'd really recommend getting a whimsical account. The prototype here on the right is a very scrappy prototype I've been working on this week. It's so unbelievably easy. Whimsical is free. You get 3 boards for free, but you can just add as much as you want to those 3 boards. So I just have every single project basically on one board. And it's great. So it's good in general because it will improve your relationship with the wider company and the wider team. Anyone you're trying to convince about the importance of content testing, it's just going to go down better if you can display it beautifully like this. And also in terms of actual testing, people aren't going to be as distracted by a stripped back wireframe than they would an actual website or a prototype of a working app. So definitely do this. This is probably my biggest tip for the whole thing. Number 3, jump on the bandwagon. Is your company running tests? Just not content specific tests? Are you speaking to your users at all? Is there any way that you're kind of getting that insight? And if so, that's amazing. Muscle in. Even if it's just one question, even if it's just one 5-second test, it's better than nothing. You've learned something about your users. And what I've found is that if you can make yourself regular participant over time, people will kind of get used to the fact that you're involved, and they'll allow you to add more and more and more. So here's just an example of, it's not really a problem for me at my company, but here's someone posting about research that they're doing. They're going to be running 4 interviews. This would be a perfect opportunity for me to say, hey, that looks super interesting. I've looked for your interview questions. They're incredible. What about if we ask this one question as well, and just muscle in there with one thing that you want to know about content? Number 4, I think this is probably one of the most commonly used phrases when it comes to content design, and one we've probably all been there for. Pick your battles. If you are struggling to get it off the ground and to get people to listen, pick a really big, meaty issue that you know is gonna deliver some kind of impact. And then when you've delivered on them, that's amazing. Try and make it a bit more regular. So this example here on the side is, again, I don't have to fight at my company to get this to happen, but here is something that I just knew would be chunky. It was some onboarding screens that explained our new, it's kind of annual, but not annual, insurance product, which was causing people a lot of confusion. We were trying to explain all of these little nuances of our product in big, chunky, walls of text, and people weren't getting it. And we were finding they were going through a really content heavy onboarding flow and getting to the end with questions left. And it was just, I knew it was awful. I'd started creating these screens over a year before. And then as the product had developed, we just dumped extra information, and then it wasn't good. So I designed this screen on the side here with this kind of comparison grid, got it tested, and it worked really well. And then when we put it live, we got a 17% increase in conversion, which is actually better than we'd expected from the initial testing that we'd done. But this is the kind of thing where if I was struggling, this is exactly where I'd put my energy. I would really, really push for this kind of change. And then you can come out and say, look, this is why we need content testing. And it's a really nice way to show that, as opposed to fighting with somebody over the word on a button, which might have no impact in the long run. And then finally, use what you know. So a lot of content designers, when we talk about content testing, feel like they're clueless about how effective their work is if they don't have the testing. And I completely understand that. You know, it's not as rewarding when you don't understand if it works or not. But we're experts and we know so much thanks to all the research that other people have completed. So there's so much we can pick from that's existing already, and we can rely on the community to learn. So we know people need really simple, plain language that they can easily understand. You can't test something, Google it. So one thing I do all the time is, if I'm not sure if a non-native English speaker will be able to understand a particular word or a phrase or something, I'll Google it and I'll see what comes up. Can they figure this out in 5 seconds or less? And if not, I'll move on. So the other day, I was having one of those crises of confidence that I spoke about earlier. I was desperate to make this screen really cool thanks to content, and I was trying to be all snazzy with the words. And I'd come up with one-stop shop to learn about your driving behaviour. And then I thought about it. I thought, one-stop shop, when was the last time I heard a real life human say that? It's snazzy, it's cute, but it's very confusing. And when I Googled it and put, one-stop shop, meaning, it came up to say an establishment where many different services or products are available. If somebody doesn't speak English as a first language and they land in our app and they see that and Google that, they're going to think, what the F are they on about? That's just not a good experience. So I changed it to this, and I've not tested it, but I know that that's a better experience. And so I can be confident in that. And yeah, you don't necessarily need to test everything. Have some confidence in what you're doing and in what others can teach you. And now finally, because I've been talking for 47 minutes, I'm going to really quickly run through an examples. I changed this from a few examples to an example earlier because I realized we wouldn't have the time. So we're going meerkat style. We're going with an examples. So close testing. This is a really interesting bit of research that we did. We found a problem. We were doing some usability testing on one of our products, and we found that people just didn't really understand a lot of the finer details about how the product works. So one of them was monthly payments. People just could not understand how monthly payments worked. And what had happened was we had just tried to over explain it. Every time we realized people weren't getting it, we tried to give them every single possible piece of information. And we'd got to a stage where people were just like, what the hell is going on here? So we took those screens. We didn't remove every 6th word like they suggest. We go rogue quite a lot, and we decided that missing out words like and the wasn't actually going to give us good results. So we moved words that we thought were crucial to the understanding of the piece and whether people would actually understand what we were talking about when we did that. So there was 3 steps to our research. Number 1, we gave them the closed screens like this one you can see here, and we asked them to fill in the gaps. Speak out loud and say what word you think would fit there. Step number 2, we gave them the completed screen. So we filled the gaps in for them. We let them read through it. Then we asked them to explain the information they'd read. And then step 3, we gave them the same closed screens as step 1, again, with all the gaps, and asked them to fill in the gaps again. So the first one, a closed screen in general, it tests for the context, comprehension, their expectations, with topics like excess on your car insurance that we did one of the screens of. What's their level of knowledge around excess? If they're able to say words like voluntary, they must understand something. And if not, maybe we need to do a better job of educating them. For step 2, we're again testing, the comprehension. Have they really understood what they've read? And then the final close, basically, it's seeing if it makes sense. Are they able to fill them all in, even when they've seen the completed screens? If they can, amazing. But if they can't get it right, even when we've given them the answer a minute before, we know that there's a problem with that content. And this gave us some really interesting results. So we showed them each of the screens. We asked them to explain what they thought I asked them to say what we thought the words were, and then we kind of recorded it. So we had attempt 1 and attempt 2. So the first thing that we did was to look at attempt 1 versus attempt 2 and see if people had improved. There were a couple of examples, one of which I'll get into in a second, where people were still in the red. So 1 to 3 was red, which meant bad. You haven't done a good job there, Grace. The amber ones were 4 to 6, and then 7 and 8 were the green words that we were like, we've done a really good job here. So yeah, we compared the two attempts, 1 and attempt 2, and we had a threshold for 5 out of 8 on the second attempt. So if any word that got less than 5 out of 8, we binned, and we just thought, this isn't going to work. We need a better word. And we also wrote down a lot of what people were saying around this. So especially the words they got wrong. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to write those down and then compare across your users, because it gives you so much insight into what they know about the topic, what they think about the topic, what they expect to see. And all of that is really, really valuable. So here's a screen that gave us lots of juicy findings. And this is actually the screen that kind of sparked the testing to begin with, because people just could not understand it. And I'd spent so long looking at it and so long thinking about it and so long trying to write it that I felt like I just couldn't even see the words anymore. So firstly, we found no one called it a billing date. Everyone said payment. No one talked about billing. And we found that introducing this term billing actually just confused people. It just wasn't how people were speaking. So universally across the app now, we've changed that word to payment, and we don't say billing anymore. And then for the second gap on the screen, which was this word here, policies, we found that everyone said payments. And this was really, really insightful. This is one of those juicy bits that you're kind of looking for. And I think because the way that payments work for this product, they're aligned with your policies, your monthly policies. And because people weren't understanding it, I thought, right, we need to go right back to basics and explain that this is how the product works, therefore this is how the payments work. But the fact that everyone got that word wrong told me that people weren't expecting to see content here about how the actual product worked, how the policies worked. And there was this whole chunk up top, this whole first chunk, before I even explain how payments work and when you can expect money to leave your account. And what's more, after we repeated the close test in step 3, only 3 out of 8 people got that right. So you can see here along the bottom, this is a screenshot from a table, and it's not really translated very well on the screen, but the word was policy. The first time 0 people got it right. The second time only 3 people got it right. So it told me that this just did not work. So we cut all of it out. And afterwards we found that people understood the payments so much better, which was incredible. And that's everything. So thank you all so much for joining me and listening to me rabbit on for 54 minutes now. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to